Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of this conference on business and human rights. My name is Michael Abiodun Olatukun, and I'm the Head of Public and Youth Engagement at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. And I am so pleased and so excited to be joined by a stellar lineup of guests who are going to be taking us through some major issues relating to the UNGPs. Just a little bit of housekeeping to sort out before we kick off though. I'd like to remind you that if you're interested in seeing the text as we're speaking, you can click the live transcript button in order to receive that alongside the speaker view. We have a Q&A function, which will enable you to put written questions to our speakers, which we hope to be able to answer over the course of the latter part of this seminar. However, that's going to be subject to my ability to control the conversation and our speakers being succinct and pithy, which I'm sure they will be. Not too sure about the former there. As you should be now aware, this session is being recorded. However, we are in webinar mode, so you yourself will not be on video, though we may refer to your name when asking any questions that you put into the Q&A function. Unfortunately, Nelleke van Amstel, who is due to be part of the panel today, is unable to join us, but Sorka, a trustee of BICL, is more than able to deal with the issues that would have been discussed during that part of the presentation. And lastly, we have a hashtag for today, which has been put into the chat on the side, which is hashtag SysInec21. That's hashtag SysInec21, because systemic inequalities are exactly the topic of discussion today. So I'd like to briefly address what we're actually looking at here. And as a young Black man with some mental health issues, I've experienced quite a lot of individual discrimination in my life. I've also experienced quite a lot of cultural discrimination in my life, where men and boys like me are shown images of gangsters and rap and various other highly dehumanizing and caricatured versions of urban life. And the world is also presented with that, leading to us being culturally viewed in a particular way. The combination of hundreds of thousands or millions of people of African descent experiencing discrimination leads to systemic issues. It leads to politicians not reflecting the communities that they represent, not listening to communities that are underrepresented, not being able to create policy decisions that serve the interests of those people. But where are we in 2021? Well, we're told that data is 21st century oil, and governments don't have much of that, but the private sector does. We're in a position where job creation and in many countries, total employment is held mostly by businesses and not by the public sector. So there is quite a significant impact that business can have on affecting positive outcomes for people across the world, especially those from disadvantaged and disenfranchised groups. And the topic that we're addressing today is how at that top level of discrimination and inequality, business can contribute to those areas. So I'd very much like to begin with one of our exceptional speakers who's joining us today. We're going to kick off with Tabisile Puma, who is an accredited public relations and communications specialist, the chairperson of GTSM, and the past president of the Public Relations Institute of South Africa. So, Tabisile, you have so much experience in the mining industry in South Africa and surrounding countries, but you also have that experience from your work at the UN and in refugee camps with gender inequality in academia. Could you start off with the big question regarding how we frame inequality? You've spoken before about how dignity is central to equality. What have we learned about the way we think about inequality and dignity, and both across the industries you've looked at and in society more broadly?
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join the webinar today. For me, I think dignity is central to equality. At a basic level, it's really about recognizing humanness. And I think some of the things you've just said now as you were contextualizing, it's really about recognizing that everyone else has got to have the opportunity to exist without being subjugated or being deprived of the ability to have quality living or livelihood for that matter. So if I look at it from a business perspective, it's important to appreciate that business is part of the environment in which we operate. So its whole value chain is linked to how society is treated. So the higher the ratio of inequality in a context, the more difficult it is for that business to truly be successful, to truly ensure that the population that it impacts can begin to grow in tandem with the business growth that business espouses. And what I like about what you just said now is about where we are today. Many years ago, inequality issues were taboo. Right now, we are able to put everything on the table. There is much more spotlight that is shown on some of the issues that talk to inequality. But I want to almost bring us back to say it's not so much about what we read out there, because sometimes we get lost in the hype of it. It is about people. It is about understanding the human need for someone to be recognized as deserving of a fair existence, and those who are in a position to do so, removing the systemic barriers that stop them from being able to be in an equal society that enables them to reach their full potential. And lastly, for me, it's about the moral question to all of us, being comfortable with others getting less than in an environment that could potentially create the much needed balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And those comments were very prescient and inspiring to me. I'd like to now go to someone who's recently been appointed as one of the non-executive directors and trustees of BICL, Sorka McLeod. Sorka is a Mary Slovatska Fellow at the University of Copenhagen and also an adjunct lecturer at the Harty School of Governance in Berlin. And the issues that Sorka I'd like you to address us on are, having worked in the private security sector and looking at that through an intersectional lens, thinking about the intermeshing of all protected characteristics and how we actually experience the world. Could you elaborate specifically on the intersectional nature of systemic inequalities, such as your work around racialized groups, for migrants, the LGBTQI+ community, the homeless and those in poverty?
Thank you, Michael. The private security sector is often one that's looked at separately from other businesses, and there is in fact an entire regulatory system to regulate this sector. And the reality is that private security is an industry that can broadly impact human rights, and in the last 20 years or so, there has been a focus on those human rights issues, but it has not been from an inequalities perspective. And it's quite clear that what we're seeing with the industry is expanding, it's moving into new spaces. We're seeing private security stepping into what had formerly been public spaces. And we are all of us more likely to encounter private security in our daily lives. Now that applies whether we're living in an armed conflict zone or a transitional justice situation, or even in a peacetime situation. And a variety of human rights issues can arise from the outsourcing of security to the private sector by governments, but also by other business clients. So other businesses have an obligation to think about their use of private security when they contract with them. But as I said, the reality is that whilst private security companies can have a broad impact on human rights, they definitely have intersectional impacts. So we heard Professor Erica George yesterday talking about the privatization of incarceration in the US context, and this is something that we're seeing more and more often in many countries where immigration detention facilities, border management is increasingly being privatized. So we can see racialized persons being particularly impacted. We can see migrants being particularly impacted, of course. We can see LGBT plus community being impacted. And it can cover a whole variety of different human rights issues. So everything from simply deprivation of liberty, but also issues around physical integrity relating to torture, the right to health, and we're seeing that particularly with COVID-19, which I'll talk about later. But what we know from the regulatory developments is that states and other regulatory actors don't think about this industry. They don't understand how, if a security company puts up a roadblock in a particular region, that it might have a disproportionate or differentiated impact on women, for example, or children who are trying to get to school. They're very sort of blinkered in the approach that they take to human rights impacts, and they take a very narrow approach to human rights impacts.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to remind our attendees that if they have any questions they'd like to pose to the panelists, please make use of the Q&A function. Excellent. So our next speaker is Mustafa Qadri, the founder and chief executive of Equidem, who works on providing strategic direction and managing projects around human rights. So, Mustafa, I think we should try and split this into two issues. First, I want to hear a bit about your work on discrimination in various contexts, especially relating to race, nationality, and gender discrimination. And also, if you can elaborate as to how these issues manifest themselves in practice. What exactly are companies doing to apply the guiding principles? And do they overlook these issues, or is it working well?
Hi, Michael. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to this really important panel. And it's really great to have heard from the speakers already. So a real learning experience for me. Michael, you really touched on two really key questions. And as you said at the very outset, I'll try very hard to be brief, even though these things are really complicated. By way of introduction, so I run an organization, Equidem, which is largely a human rights investigative organization. We're relatively unique in that the investigations that we do are conducted by rights holders themselves. And so a big part of our work is in the Arab Gulf countries, places where there are millions of low-wage migrant workers. And so our own team are themselves current or former migrant workers, giving us a really intimate understanding of what they face. And what they basically report is that racial, national, and gender, other forms of discrimination, is baked into the labor regime that controls the way that foreign workers that come into the Gulf are treated, both in law and practice. And so what that basically means is that if you are a foreigner working in the Gulf, then your employer has a highly permissive system to control your movement in the country, to changing your job. If you want to complain about your conditions, it's very easy for an employer to cancel your visa, making up some kind of allegation against you. At the same time, that if you are particularly a low-wage worker from the global south, well, from the moment that you enter the Gulf, you are racialized. So what does that mean? It means that if you are a Bangladeshi worker, you're most likely to be presumed to be only good for being a cleaner or a gardener and given a certain pay rate, which is typically much lower. if you are a Black African worker, you're typically assumed to be the kind of person that can be a security guard or a driver or the porter in a hotel. So the whole system is highly racialized. And so what we've seen with the work that we've done, a big part of that is to provide an evidence base to document what workers are really facing, to give workers a voice, but then to build on that to say, well, look, it's not just a matter of how the labor market operates. It's very much about how this system has been set up. And, some research that we did last year, quite extensive research into the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on workers in the Gulf, found that obviously the pandemic was a huge impact on business, on ways of working. But beyond that, states actually weakened labor protections so that it was easier for employers to fire low-wage workers from the global south, to reduce their pay, or even simply put them on unpaid leave for an unspecified period of time. So it meant that workers from the global south were facing issues like wage theft and other things which are basically classic forced labor indicators. And so obviously there's a long story to that, which we can unravel during our discussion. But one key takeaway for businesses is that some businesses, because they're so prominent in the Gulf context, have taken steps to really integrate the UNGPs and human rights processes into the way that they operate. But these tend to focus on the really low-hanging, quantitative issues like, are workers being paid on time? Is their food hygienic? Are their work and living conditions safe? Those are really critical issues. There's no issue with that. But they don't, for example, look at whether is a worker being paid less for the same job simply because they're African or they're a woman or because they belong to a minority. Are workers actually being allowed opportunities for job mobility regardless of where they come from or based on their skill? I've spoken to so many workers, for example, that might come from Nigeria or Kenya or from India, have highly skilled qualifications. And yet when they come to a place like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, the assumption by the local recruiters or employers is that, well, you're from that country, therefore you're only good for that. Or a women worker working in a COVID ward as an essential worker doing a critical job, being paid often sometimes less than half what a male counterpart is being paid for the same work. These are some of the, I would argue, low-hanging fruit areas where solutions are there. And if we have companies, the biggest companies in the world are present in the Gulf, that are rightly at the forefront in many ways of the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter movement in more developed economies, then why can't they apply those same principles in practice to their businesses in the Gulf? I would argue that if they don't do that, people will start noticing that and the hypocrisy will be really blatant. So it's a real issue there, but also it's an opportunity. Obviously, these are deep problems, takes a long time, but those are really some key things, key steps that businesses can start taking already.
Thank you very much. And it's really interesting to hear about how that sort of approach can lead to such differential outcomes, even between classes of people with similar skills. And I suppose thinking a bit more about the process, do you think there's a tendency to focus on or emphasize certain issues whilst perhaps overlooking others in the due diligence process of human rights? Do you think that there are some issues that are maybe invisible or that need to be raised more to the forefront?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So, the great thing with the UNGPs is that much of it is a common sense process. So it's really about mapping out your current or likely human rights impacts and doing ongoing due diligence monitoring. Well, we don't really need to do much digging to know that, for example, if you are a business in the Gulf, that certain nationalities tend to be associated with certain types of work, and that certain nationalities are associated particularly with low wage work. So one thing that businesses can do from the outset is ensuring that whatever wages are paid or whatever conditions are provided, that these are not based on the nationality of the worker, that the human resources department or recruiters don't use the curtain of, oh, it's the labor market doing its job to excuse what is blatant racial or national-based discrimination. Or that if you have female workers in your workplace, making sure there's gender sensitization to how that works. So that, for example, when you have workers typically working in the city, for example, but their accommodation is in very remote locations.
Mustafa,
sorry, I pressed the space bar and muted myself.
The gesticulation, too passionate.
I know, I was actually gesticulating underneath, so that sort of channeling my outrage there. But just to say lastly that, yeah, so I mean, with women workers, for example, I mean, often there's just simply no thinking about what are the gendered impacts or potential risks for them. And what happens often in the Gulf, for example, is the approach they take is that there's, for example, a curfew on a women-only accommodation site. They can't leave their accommodation after a certain time, often quite early, like say 9 p.m. You know, my colleagues have spoken to women workers who have had to get essential medical services, but can't get that because of curfew, or it's claimed that there isn't enough female staff, health professionals where they're going. So those are the sorts of things that, thinking ahead, obviously there's a deeper issues to that. There's the legislative environment as well. But those are some of the really practical things that can be done. Very lastly, just to say, the Gulf states, most of them actually prohibit trade union related rights, which we feel is a significant impediment in the long term and right now to workers being able to exercise their human rights. At the same time, there are a number of laws that actually really discriminate against women. This includes, for example, laws that prohibit sex out of marriage, that mean in many cases, workers like domestic workers or hospitality workers, when they face sexual or other physical harm, they may actually get prosecuted rather than getting help. Now, I've spoken to many businesses who say, well, that's the law, how can we change that? But in fact, you see already practices with businesses where they set up things such as legitimate worker committees that are independent, workers elect their representatives, and also providing safe spaces for women workers and providing a whole range of grievance remedy mechanisms to shield them from those issues. So there are a lot of actual ways in which already, despite the legislative environment being very restrictive on human rights, that businesses can actually themselves proactively address these points. And, you know, I'll leave you, Michael, with this one point, final point, is that, you know, people often in our position as skilled workers, so-called skilled workers, we don't just think about whether we're being paid well or whether, you know, we're getting nice food, although those things are really important. We think about the holistic idea of our well-being. Are we happy with our job? Does it feel fulfilling? Are we on a career path to better opportunities? You know, it's simply about often businesses, employers, and state authorities to be thinking about low-wage workers from the global south the way they would think of high-skilled workers. There are possibly off-the-shelf solutions already being applied for, you know, young graduate professionals that could be adapted for workers that are much more marginalized. And it goes back to your invisible point. Let's turn on the lights. Let's stop this invisibility. You know, there are definitely solutions out there.
Certainly, and I think that when you're thinking about systemic and structural issues, it is not enough to merely comply with the bottom lowest common denominator of activity. Taking those further steps to think about higher order issues like fulfillment and development is certainly part and parcel of what several of our speakers have spoken today, a true appreciation of human dignity. I certainly think that those are incredibly important points that we should certainly talk again about later. Excellent. I'd like to move us on to our next speaker, Grace Matongu. Grace is a research fellow at the Centre for Intellectual Property and IT Law at Strathmore University, researching ICT policy in Kenya and across Africa more generally. So, Grace, it would be great to hear from you about your work, again, looking at inequalities, but I'd like to wind the clock back a little bit to look at how Pan-African issues like decolonization and coloniality impact upon that, and the relationship that those issues have with the UNGPs.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to meet all the panelists and anybody who's following us from the audience. Also, just to start with a disclaimer that I'm here as a student from the University of Nairobi, where I study digital ID from a social justice perspective. And maybe I'd just like to pick up from the issues that Mustafa has raised, which are quite real in the country Kenya where I live, and East Africa as a whole. Every time you go online, you see all these cases of Kenyans or Ugandans who are stuck in the Arab world. And maybe the question to ask is, what conditions make it necessary for these workers to go and work there? How come such high-skilled workers, and you know, the reason why a lot of East Africans, for example, go to these countries is because they can speak English. And we speak English because we are a former British colony. So how come with this big thing called speaking English, we are still, when we go out there, we don't get what speaking English should be able to get you, you know, because it's not easy to speak English, by the way. You have to go to school. In many cases, the public school system is broken, so your parents have to invest a lot for you to be able to get to a certain level. So how come after putting in all that, after following what the system tells you to follow, life still gives you these unfair cards, yeah? And I argue that it's what we are calling decoloniality, that it is true that we got independence, but we are still so much ruled by the same forces that ruled our ancestors and grandparents in the last century during colonialism. So you find that we keep moving to new eras, but we haven't really separated ourselves and gotten real freedom to be able to change our condition. And so there are those workers who are working in the Arabian world. Today I was reading a really interesting article about how even when these big technology companies set up shop in Africa, what they're doing is that they are poaching everybody who's sort of an engineer or who's well skilled in the digital, with digital skills, the skills that are needed for the digital world. They're poaching them all to come and work for them, which means that it's still a brain drain, just that it's happening in your own country because the production of these workers is going to these companies. And so the question becomes then, why is this happening? What can business do? And remember, even at the colonial time, it was still business that led us to that point, and it was still business that pushed us to that colonial economy. So what can why is business doing this, or what can business do better? And this is still a really open question, especially as we move into new areas. You find that countries like Kenya are very quick to adopt new frameworks like the UNGPs. I think we were the first, if not the top 3 in Africa to adopt the UNGPs. But then the UNGPs themselves, or the focus of the UNGPs has been on what we already know. Yeah, mining, you know, land, the physical land that we know of. But well, these are important issues and we should deal with them. We are stopping to deal with the past without taking note of the present and the future, which is digital. So you find that, you know, the UNGPs have not, at least how they've been applied into Kenya, they've not focused sufficiently on digital issues, on issues like, you know, the brain drain that is happening with digital labor, on issues like the way the digital economy is making Africans consumers and not producers. You know, there's very little making of technology that is happening in Africa. What is happening even with digital ID, which I work on, is everything is being imported into the continent, and you're told, oh yeah, from now on, use your biometrics to identify yourselves. This biometrics you made, is this technology that you made? No, it came from somewhere else and became part of how you experience your relationship with government. And so these are the questions that make you feel as if UNGPs and other new frameworks are just dealing with surface level issues, because the UNGPs do not acknowledge that the reason why these business practices have become problematic, the reason why profit making is, profit making as the core reason for business, why it's a problem, is related to our past, is related to colonialism, capitalist extraction. And this cannot be dealt with only using human rights, or, as the UNGP say, international human rights, which is quite limited. The issues that Mustafa was talking about, or my colleagues before were talking about, can they all be dealt with under human rights? No, perhaps the UNGPs need to look into other issues and other ways of resolving these issues.
Thank you very much, guys. I found myself thinking quite deeply throughout all of that. And I suppose one of the challenges that people often raise to the argument that, well, the world is different now, is that we might well apply existing principles to new technology. With all of that in mind, how effective do you think the UNGPs are overall? Do you think that they can be effective? Do you think that they can help to dismantle some of the systems of structural oppression, or what are the other things that you think might need to complement it in order to be successful on some of these thorny long-term issues?
I was looking at the UNGP's, I think it's called 10+ report, the one that considers how the UNGPs have been for 10 years. And they rightly acknowledge that there has been very minimal involvement of global South countries, Africa in particular. Yet these are some of the places that are affected by business because of the multinational nature of some of the businesses that led to UNGPs actually being formed. And I thought that, that would be one entry point for UNGPs to really increase participation of these people who are not as active in the as the UNGPs were being formed. But I also thought that it is not so much about increasing the numbers, but making that participation meaningful. For example, I also like to look at what the African Union has done in terms of, thinking about making businesses accountable to all stakeholders. And the African Union would at least the papers they've come out with, they emphasize on the interconnectedness of rights. They emphasize on economic and social rights. They emphasize on the indivisibility of rights. So, for example, in the digital sphere, there has been a tendency to look at privacy, and it is something that's easy for tech companies to agree to. Okay, we shall now look at privacy. We shall ensure that we are very keen on how we hand over your private data to governments. We shall make sure they follow court orders, and so on and so forth. But you see, this is only one right. And while it's very important, there are so many other interconnected rights, including what I was speaking about. Do we have a right to also enjoy science and enjoying the benefits of this science that is coming to the continent? Do we have a right to also be producers of this science and enjoy the economic benefits that come from our data? So much data is being produced from Africa. Everybody's coming into Africa. So I'd say then the UNGPs are a good starting point because they expand the right, the duty bearers from just states to also businesses that are involved in former colonial states like Africa and the global South in general. But they need to meaningfully and more deeply engage with the systems that exist with systemic issues and systemic inequalities, including those that are as a result of colonialism of the past centuries.
Absolutely, and I've always seen quite a lot of credence in the criticisms of structures that try to superimpose the civil and political rights without looking deeper into the economic and the social, which can often be the real manifestation of people's difficulties. And you're thinking even deeper than that to some of the causes of those causes. And that level of thinking, I think, is often absent when these things are put together. Someone who I think might have quite a lot to say about that because of a previous contribution, who I'd like to bring back in, is Tabi Sile. In terms of those wider structural challenges that perpetuate inequalities, Tabi Sile, you told us a bit about how you might talk about closing gaps versus building bridges. Could you tell us a bit about that idea and how that might relate to some of the things that Grace was speaking about?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think Grace touched a lot on the systemic issues that we're dealing with. There needs to almost be a recognition that inequality was historically engineered in a lot of our contexts. And therefore it is important as we look at issues of inequality to appreciate that it's not going to take a short space of time to fix inequality. We are going to have to deal with the fact that it needs to start with a shift in power, a shift in awareness, and a shift in resources. I mean, earlier we were talking about, people are so linear in the way they look at human rights issues. We need to broaden our framing and understanding and begin to look at the fact that it manifests itself in so many different legs, that when we look at the gross violation of human rights, we shouldn't miss the opportunity of the structural inequalities that continue to actually nestle it and ensure that it continues to this day, as Grace has alluded to. So for me, that is why I talk about, we need to be cognizant of the fact that the gap is too big. And therefore, is our reality, while it's not insurmountable to close, should our reality be closing the gap with all the structural designs and the web that are so deep in the different contexts, or be beginning to be talking about a shift which talks to closing the gap, building the bridge, where people who are in a privileged position can begin to move closer to the reality of those who are not privileged, can begin to move closer to the reality of discrimination, so that, to Mustafa's point, people can begin to be aware that something as simple as a wage gap that is unequal, that is a human rights issue, because people tend to look at security issues. Somebody has gunned someone down, people have been displaced, because those overt human rights issues are easy to identify. It is the covert ones that are endemic in our society, endemic in the structures in which you operate, that I really think we need to put an effort in dealing with. And to Grace's point, yes, the frameworks are perfect, but it is the framing in which we need to begin to look at these things, so that we begin to understand human rights from a local context, from what the need for equality looks like for those who are experiencing inequality, because we sometimes tend to externalize standards at the expense of social contexts, which actually carry a lot of this fiber of inequality that we're talking about. I mean, you could talk about cultural rights, you could talk about all those things, and we begin to then ask, to what extent, if you look at some of the rights violations that you find in business, are rooted in the cultural rights that maybe people are not really cognizant of. So I think for me, it is easy to say we can close the gap, let's bring people, let's make sure that we close it. It is a big gap. It will not only require us talking about it, us putting standards in place, but it's going to require the political will and the moral will of various role players. But if you then contextualize it with where I come from, where you've got weak governments in most cases, where you've got weak business sector in terms of the local context, you then have a situation, as was earlier described, that the gap widens without everybody talking
Tavisile, I think we've had some kind of audio or internet interruption. Have we still got you there? Tavisile, can you hear us? But that was a superb contribution, replete with practical examples, and thank you very much for sharing that. I now think we should pin a bit more onto these practical examples of the lessons that we can take from what's gone on so far and how to build on them. And to do that, I'd like to ask Mustafa to take us there. How do we take any lessons learned forward, and what are they?
Sure, thanks, Michael. Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer. I think that there certainly are certain places where there are lots of examples perhaps people might have. I find that in the Gulf context, what you have instead is, in terms of discrimination, there might be things being done in terms of other human rights, but in terms of discrimination, in fact, that process is still a long way away. One thing that I've seen that is promising, although I think it still needs much more work, is around what I mentioned earlier around worker committees. The idea that certainly on certain mega projects and these sort of public facing events like the World Cup in Qatar or Dubai Expo, that workers are allowed to actually elect representatives to then talk about labor or other issues that they may be facing. And those committees are, as far as I can tell, non-discriminatory in nature, so that it's not a nationality-based system or that sort of a thing. Now, they're not a perfect solution, but they are a critical step at which, for example, workers can have a seat at the table with executives, with stakeholders of an entire business enterprise, or the whole chain of a business endeavor. And that's a really important practical example of how those things can be addressed. Having said that, as other speakers have mentioned as well, one of the most fundamental, flagrant, but also simple ways in which discrimination comes out is in differences in wage earnings or in the type of work workers have. Employers, we know, tend to still say that, well, because this is about your contract, it's a private matter, that we have to ironically respect your right to privacy. We can't really talk about that at a worker committee. So I think that, we have to think about other ways in which we address that, but that is one really simple way that can be done. I do know that in some enterprises and projects, they have also started to create safe spaces for women and certain minority groups. That, for example, in some projects, although it's highly rare this happens, but it does happen, you have quite a rich history from South Asia, of a transgender community across a number of South Asian states. There have been some businesses, although very rare, that have had the awareness to realize that we have to create a space for minorities like that to be able to express themselves, to have exercise their social rights. And so I think that's something that we really have to look at building on. And I think also partially because you have in the Gulf a place that in the middle of the summer and the spring, it is literally quite inhospitable to be working outside, itself bringing up other human rights issues. But there is already precedent in terms of creating spaces that are, habitable in those difficult periods of the year. Another really simple thing is around making sure workers have access to a social life and services that everyone else can get. And so what I mean by that is, if you go to the Gulf, although it's not unique to the Gulf, I imagine many listeners and speakers today would know about this, that the low-wage workers may work in the concentrated areas where business activity is there, or where there's a degree of wealth and opportunity, but they live somewhere very far. So the hospitals and services, even just being able to go to restaurants or to cinemas or to play sport, those opportunities are very limited. So, programs around urbanizing workers or getting workers more integrated into the society is actually a really simple way to, in some way, trying to deal with that discrimination. And you do see that in some respects. I've traveled to the Gulf quite a bit. In, for example, Qatar, there has been in some of the industrial parks been an initiative to build shopping malls, to provide sporting facilities, so that workers, particularly in those areas who are predominantly sort of younger men, have space to actually live a life, to enjoy themselves. So those are some of the simple ways. I would still argue, like I said earlier, there are still a lot of things really lacking. So in terms of how workers are recruited and making that process more responsible and ethical, transparent, but also in terms of the kind of opportunities available to workers, really reducing the link between your race, your nationality, and the kind of work that you're getting. And another point, which is, I don't think really that radical, which is to say that even if the local law basically requires employers to protect their workers and their wages if they're nationals in a way that's quite inverse to what they're required to do with non-nationals, well, apply the high standards applied to nationals and to wealthy, sort of high-skilled foreign workers who are predominantly white workers. Apply those rules and principles to your entire workforce, because anyone who has worked in the Gulf context will know that even at the low wage worker level, if you have workers that are of a good quality, if are very skilled at what they do, you want to retain those people. And you've already seen with some of the governments in the Gulf, at least in terms of the language, they're talking about job mobility and skills capture. So apply the same rules. Sounds like a really simple thing to say, but apply the same rules and benefits protections that you do to nationals and high wage workers to low wage workers. But there's no question, there's still a long way to go. But I would argue very strongly that businesses can be real leaders in this area, and that practically any major business that you can think of, whether it's a well-known company or not, is itself exposed to this issue, discrimination in the Gulf context, likely in many other parts of the world. So they have a moral duty to do something. But in fact, I would argue that the reputational and other forms of liability on companies are already there. So in fact, there's no real excuse for them not to be trying to address these issues.
Thank you very much for that. It was very comprehensive, and I'm sure any CSR leads who were wondering about the ethical and moral considerations of treating people with dignity will learn quite a lot from that contribution live and from the recording. Now that we've got you back, Tabisile, did you want to wrap up your previous contribution just before the internet connection interrupted?
No, thank you so much, and apologies, we were load shed in my part of the country, so we have that inequality issue. But on a serious note, I think just in wrapping up, and the question was, what are the challenges industries are facing? I think a lot more companies are opening themselves up to do the right thing in as far as human rights are concerned. The challenge, obviously, is the gap of awareness that I spoke about earlier, but they also find themselves in contexts that are so steeped in inequality that it becomes difficult for them to then implement some of the non-obvious human rights issues that they're talking to. I mean, you can talk to issues of gender rights as an example, where a company may have policies that do advocate for the respect of those rights, but then you find that you operate in communities which may have been structurally designed to want inequality to thrive. And you can look at it from any perspective outside of a cultural perspective. But then the reality is you may find that in some cases, and I'll talk as myself as a woman, that in some cases women actually prefer not to have some of those rights afforded to them on the basis of probably religion, sometimes probably culture, particularly in the African context. And I'm talking about South Africa in this case, without knowing the other cultures in other environments. So the challenges then that business find is how to then reskill or rejoin a collective effort with the countries in which you operate, the context in which you operate, so that you can move in tandem in manifesting the new reality. Because it's one thing to advocate for it, but if you don't put in place the capacity for the human rights culture to thrive, you are then going to be stuck with these beautiful glossy reports where we all espouse to statements, but in actual fact, it's difficult for us to move the dial towards a human rights reality, because there's so many endemic issues that maybe are barriers that are not so obvious that we are not looking into. So in conclusion, I think the covert issues are easy to deal with, but we need to begin to invest, and particularly as the human rights movement, to engage companies, but also to engage governments about this covert human rights issues that sometimes we miss, because the lens with which we look at it in the popular media are not necessarily what everybody should be looking to. And Mustafa highlighted that. Grace was very clear about the colonial tenets that still exist across Africa, and I'm sure in other continents, that unless you deal with those endemic issues, you will never be in a position, even as a business that is willing to move the dial, unless you get a coalition of the willing in the many stakeholders that need to help you move the agenda of human rights forward. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I think it's really important that you throw down the gauntlet to deal with the issues that are causing the current problems that people face. And we do have reporting that's much too superficial in these areas, focusing merely on the manifestation that's visible today rather than those longer term historic causes. So that's a really important contribution. Thank you very much. So now we move to the introduction of our final speaker, Fola Adeleke, who is a thought leader on international economic law and human rights, information rights, open government, accountability, and many other areas, shall we say. And he has focused quite a lot on the extractive industry, which is a fellow Nigerian, is an area where there's been a revolving door between government and business where people's interests haven't necessarily been worked out. And I'm certainly very thankful for him having looked into this area. He's a former head of research at the South African Human Rights Commission and has supervised clinical projects on business and human rights at Harvard Law School, amongst many other interesting things. So, Fola, I'd like to talk quite specifically about MSIs, the multi-stakeholder initiatives. What role do you think they could play here for the uninitiated? What are they? And have you seen any best practice that might emerge as to how they might deal with some of these systemic inequalities?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the other speakers as well. I've thoroughly enjoyed just actively listening to responses from my colleagues. Really, thank you for the great conversation. And over the last couple of days and in this session as well, we've heard about how global corporations are increasingly regarded as contributors to global inequality. For example, through the tax evasion, the manipulation of compliance with state regulation, among several other issues. And these have led to this intense public scrutiny and demand for corporate accountability. While the legal core of corporations continues to be the prioritization of shareholder value, corporations have embraced the concept of multi-stakeholder initiatives, MSIs, which has also been promoted is to set standards apparently aimed at solutions for corporate accountability, including the role of business in human rights protection and in driving sustainability, for example. And MSIs often involve a collaboration among various public and private actors, such as corporations, government, CSOs, and rights holders. The participation of governments and civil society organizations often give legitimacy to this voluntary self-regulation process, which creates perceptions of corporate accountability. And these MSIs, we know, set global voluntary industry standards for its corporate members to follow, and are often counted as addressing public interest issues such as human rights violations in specific industries. And they are geared towards establishing a form of governance model to tackle a gap where a state either cannot or will not fulfill its duty to protect its citizens against human rights violations by corporations. Yet, MSIs are not accountable to the public, they are not fully transparent, and their effectiveness in realizing the purported objective of corporate accountability is not necessarily fully known. While some MSIs focus on a narrow solution to deal with a number of issues, for example, like corporate transparency and addressing corruption, such as the EITI, others use certification models to help corporations claim legitimacy in ethics, in sustainability, in human rights protection. And despite this increasing popularity of MSIs, it is clear that self-regulation through this governance model is not the answer to driving corporate accountability. for interest issues. I sit on the board of MSI Integrity, which is a non-profit in the US, and this organization has spent more than a decade working on MSIs. And recently released a report on the grand experiment of MSIs. And we concluded that while MSIs can have benefits as programs for shared learning, dialogue, and experimentation in their current form, they have failed to adequately give voice and power to workers and communities, and thus have been ineffective at holding corporations to account for abuse or to reliably protect human rights or provide communities with access to remedies. Even the UNGPs, which back the role for MSIs in human rights protection, acknowledge that poorly designed grievance mechanisms within the MSIs can risk compounding a sense of grievance among affected rights holders by heightening their sense of disempowerment and disrespect by the process. And our report also found that the involvement of MSIs often creates public misperceptions and distracts public attention and resources from more comprehensive solutions that will prevent corporate whitewashing and involve the home state of multinationals rather than this singular focus on host states when dealing with corporate behavior. So I think this shows that we need to rethink the role of MSIs, and the presence of an MSI in an industry should not be a substitute for effective public regulation. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we had a few issues hearing you, and I've proposed a couple of alternate ways we might resolve that in the chat that you might try. Whilst you're having a go at that, I'd very much appreciate Sorka telling us a little bit about, again, the work that she's been doing with Nelica and any recent impacts that the pandemic has had on that area, whether, as we often hear, this very trite expression that the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities, or if new ones have cropped up solely as a result of what we've had over the last 18 months or so. So I'd be really keen to hear about the impact of that on our discussion today.
Thank you, Michael, and I think it's interesting, you know, that I'm talking after Fola, because one of the interesting things for the private security industry is that we have a couple of MSIs that are involved in attempting to regulate private military and security companies, and what so Nelica and I have been involved in the development of these MSIs and the regulatory structures and the mechanisms around them for the last more years than I care to remember, let's just put it that way. And we decided that we wanted to look at how private military and security companies are in fact addressing gender. And this came from the fact that I was working on Nelica and I were both working on the gender report that the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries published in 2019. I've already shared it in the chat, and we decided we wanted to look at how these companies are in fact, if they are in fact, addressing the gendered impacts. Now, it's very well known that the private security industry is a highly gendered industry. And you know, there's sort of a perception that it's an industry, you know, you've got a lot of, you know, it kind of overlaps with mercenaries, and you have, you know, the idea that they're soldiers of fortune. And of course, this is very much exacerbated by the image of private military and security companies operating in the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan in nearly 2 decades ago, of course. But the reality is, as Mustafa was saying, is that in the security industry, we're actually often dealing with very low-paid, low-trained workforces. And there are hierarchies. There are racialized hierarchies within the industry, and there are gendered hierarchies within the industry. And I published a piece in the Business and Human Rights Journal in 2019 with my colleague, Dr. Rebecca de Winter-Schmidt. And we looked at how auditing and certification was being carried out by private military security companies, as is expected of them by the multi-stakeholder initiatives. So we have the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Providers, which in order to get certification of the International Code of Conduct Association, which is the MSI, you have to be audited and get certification from third-party auditors. And we discovered in that piece of research quite a lot of problems and gaps with the way in which companies were in fact trying to address human rights and doing their human rights due diligence. We're only able to look at publicly available information. It's a very opaque industry. It's very difficult to actually look at what's going on the ground. So Nellik and I decided to take the methodological approach that Rebecca and I had taken 2 years ago, and to apply a gendered lens to what private security companies are doing. And there have been some other developments recently. So the International Code of Conduct Association had produced guidance on PSEA and sexual and gender-based violence. There's been increasing discussion within the industry and the MSI around the impact of the Women in Peace and Security agenda. And so we went in, perhaps naively, looking back on it now, we went in and looked at the publicly available documents that companies have on their websites as part of their obligations of meeting the certification standards. And so we looked at their human rights policy, and we asked, does the company have a human rights policy that just basically mentions sex or gender discrimination? Are there any references in any company documentation to PSEA or to sexual and gender-based violence? Were there any references to gender discrimination, inequality, or sexual harassment in the documentation? And do the corporate grievance mechanisms, the operational level grievance mechanisms, integrate a gender perspective? Now, we looked at 36 companies. At the time, when we were doing the research, the International Code of Conduct Association had 36 certified companies. And we decided to look at them because these are the companies that are supposed to be, the highest standard. They are supposed to, gold star companies. They've achieved a certification standard, and they have then been certified by the International Code of Conduct Association. And it was pretty horrifying, the results. Of the 36, 20 did have a human rights policy that referenced sexual and or gender discrimination. Now, that's good in the sense that the International Code of Conduct explicitly requires them to address that. But there were no human rights policies available publicly for 8 of the companies. So we couldn't actually even see what was going on as far as gender was concerned. And another 6 didn't reference gender at all in their human rights policy. So of course, that we can see similar problems with the documentation in terms of reference to PSEA, reference to sexual and gender-based violence. 13 did mention, 13 did not mention it, 8 had no documentation at all. Are there references to gender discrimination, inequality, or sexual harassment in the company documentation? Now, again, this is something we would expect to see because the Code of Conduct requires it. 20 did have some sort of reference, 6 didn't, nothing available at all for 8. And then we come to the operational level corporate grievance mechanism. And we think about UNGP 31 in terms of what makes a good corporate level grievance mechanism. So in terms of accessibility, in terms of legitimacy, all of those transparency, all of those human rights elements, and looking at it from the gender lens of our colleagues on the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And 27 out of the 36 had no apparent gender perspective in their corporate level grievance mechanism. And even more concerningly, there was no accessible grievance mechanism for 7 of these companies. Now, as I said, these are supposed to be the creme de la creme, the gold star companies, and so we probably overestimated what companies were doing. So there are some real concerns there about what companies are doing to address gendered issues. And as I said in my first intervention, one of the problems for the industry is that the Code of Conduct looks at human rights in a very, very narrow way. And I think this was mentioned by Tabisile, earlier on, that there's this very narrow conception of what human rights is. So the International Code of Conduct mentions, I think, 6 human rights. So it mentions the right to life, it mentions the right to be free from torture, talks about detention, it makes some reference to human trafficking, child labour, forced labour, and then there's sort of the discrimination provisions, and that is it. And so the industry tends to think about human rights from this very, very narrow perspective. And there was a question in the Q&A asking about how can we deal with this practically. Well, I think one of the key things is that the code needs to be broader in its references to human rights. The companies and their clients need to understand that human rights are to be understood broadly and not narrowly. I think there's too much, the industry tends to think, oh, we only violate human rights if we're standing there with a gun. And that's not the reality. And we've seen this really coming to the fore and coming to light with COVID-19. And so, Michael, you asked me how has COVID-19 exacerbated the issues? Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, we've got these companies moving into new spaces. They are moving into, so we've seen with COVID that they are guarding vaccination facilities, they're guarding hospitals, they are guarding quarantine hotels and quarantine facilities. And there's a couple of different things going on. We see that the security guards themselves are being put into very dangerous positions. The UK's Office of National Statistics published a report last year that showed that private security guards in the UK were a group of workers that was, I think, second only after medical personnel in terms of mortality rates due to COVID-19. And so you've got a racialized, poorly paid workforce that is additionally being put at risk. You can see the same thing happening in private prisons, in privatized migration detention facilities. You see the guards are in these positions. They didn't have proper personal protective equipment early on in the pandemic. They were in facilities where there was not capacity for social distancing, all of these different things. So you've got that side of things with COVID, because it's not new that this is an industry that is poorly paid, poorly regulated, and very problematic. From the other perspective, from a broader human rights perspective, COVID-19 has illustrated the lack of regulation or lack of proper and effective regulation of the industry. And it has really highlighted how marginalized groups can be particularly impacted by private security. So Mustafa already mentioned curfews. So curfews are an interesting tool that states have used during COVID-19. And of course, that can have a particular impact on homeless people, for example. In terms of they're on the streets, they cannot observe a curfew. We've also seen evidence that there's been collaboration and complicity between public security and private security, where families have been evicted from their homes in the middle of a pandemic, which of course has huge implications on the right to home and family life, but also on the right to health. How can you socially distance? How can you meet curfews if you've been evicted? We've also seen similar situations where private security and public security have operated together to evict minorities or indigenous communities from the land. So we've seen an increase in land grabs in certain parts of the world. So we've got that aspect that's ongoing. Just to give you one final example of how marginalized communities can be impacted. When it comes to the privatized prisons and the migration detention facilities, we have seen women, we have seen the LGBT plus community, and racialized persons experiencing particular problems. So in the United States, for example, we have seen trans women and gay men, some of whom are HIV positive, not being able to get proper access to healthcare. So trans women not getting access to hormonal treatment or not getting access to HIV medication. We've seen disabled persons or persons with disabilities also not being able to get proper health care within these privatized detention facilities that are being manned or run by private security contractors. So what the international community needs to look at is properly regulating the industry, properly engaging with the international mechanisms that already exist. There are only 7 countries that are members of the International Code of Conduct Association, which is extremely poor. I think we're somewhere now around 100 company members, and I think 45 certified companies. I understand that the code is going to be open for review next year, which I think is very much to be welcomed. One of the audit standards is currently being reviewed, but there are pushbacks from the industry. And I think one of the biggest concerns is that there's been a push towards sort of the SDGs and also to sort of equality, sort of ESG approaches as well. And I think this is very, very concerning because human rights have a legal basis and a legal foundation, and we are justiciable. We can claim human rights. It's much, much more difficult to argue that you have a legal right under the SDGs. And I think that this is very, very problematic if the industry is going to go down that route and sort of folding human rights into other considerations. And I'm going to stop there, but I can happy to answer more questions.
Thank you very much, Soka. I did have one follow-up question, which was around the justiciability and causes of action. Have we got any cases on the issues of systemic inequality that you discussed, or has the jurisprudence not quite caught up yet? Soka, you're still on mute.
I'm on mute. There are very few cases involving private security contractors. There are a few cases that have gone through the US courts in relation to the use of private security contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, we saw with Blackwater, we saw that President Trump pardoned the Blackwater contractors who'd been involved in the Nisar Square massacre. There have been some other attempts to hold contractors, the corporate at the corporate level, accountable for human rights violations. Many of them are settled out of court, so this is very problematic. We need to see regulation at the domestic level and at the international level improved. I think the research that Nellika and I did, whilst obviously we were focused on gender, the fact that 7 out of the 36 companies that we looked at had no corporate level grievance mechanism at all, obviously has broader implications for other marginalized groups. And even some of those that did have corporate level grievance mechanisms, they didn't take into account things like the fact that perhaps a woman might have to be accompanied to make a complaint. They didn't take account of language or literacy issues. So you've got some of the mechanisms that were only available in English in non-English speaking countries. Now, of course, that's hugely problematic. Now, having said that, there are some companies that are doing, there are some signs of positivity, but they're very, very limited. So there are some companies that are using sort of hotlines where somebody can call to register a complaint, and they can choose the language that they want to make the complaint. And so I think this is definitely a useful way to structure your corporate level grievance mechanism. It does away with the issues around literacy. It does away with the language issues. So there's some very slow progress. I think we're a long way further forward than we were prior to the code, and I think some companies are moving in the right direction, but the code itself is problematic, and it's pushing them in a very particular way and making them think about human rights in this very narrow, very particular way that does not take into account systemic inequalities in any meaningful sense.
Oh, much of that is quite depressing, but I think it really lays out the scope of the challenge. And to think that organizations at that end, who you would assume might have more resources to be able to incorporate these things, don't even have basic mechanisms through which people can adjudicate grievances is really quite shocking. And I suppose to cap off our contributions from our speakers, I'd like to go back to Fola to tell us a bit about whether or not there's something about the type of company or the shape of the company or the structure of the company that can impact upon how well the guiding principles are put into effect. So Fola, can you tell us a bit about your research into how company structure and shape can alter or not the way they try to resolve systemic inequalities?
Thank you, Michael, and I hope that you can hear me a lot better now. I'm sorry for my earlier responses and the glitching connection. I think to respond to that question, I will probably build off on some of the excellent points that Mustafa already made earlier. We know that the legal core of corporations continue to be the prioritization of shareholder value. However, to tackle the governance and accountability of corporations, we need to expand the interests that corporations serve. In the existing model for the corporate firm, while shareholders are recognized as those who hold financial interest or investments in a company, there have been attempts to broaden the definition of who a shareholder is, and there have been various options emerging, including employee ownership schemes and the recognition of benefit corporations. However, these alternative models do not sufficiently focus on the diversity of stakeholders and the inclusion of rights holders who are affected by a company's operations in the management and governance of that company. Workers and affected communities are at the center, should be at the center of decision making. And we need to ask, what if workers and communities were empowered to influence their working conditions or the decisions that impact their lives? What if workplace democracy was a universally recognized human rights? And Mustafa gave excellent examples of the workplace committees that is happening in the Middle East. We need to ask, what if a key economic beneficiary of enterprises were the workers of wider communities impacted by these corporations? MSIs that I was speaking about earlier were championed as the anti-model to the traditional cooperative board, but the presence of different stakeholder groups in MSIs, which were intended to express the quality of parties in decision making, does not necessarily show the power dynamics in MSIs, where you have big corporation versus a local CSO, which often affect the effectiveness of the diversity in these kind of groups. And the effort to advance multi-stakeholderism at the industry-wide level offers important insights and lessons when designing new and creative, effective models and policies for worker-centered corporate governance, shared ownership, and stakeholder capitalism, which can all be seen as efforts at advancing the multi-stakeholderism at the company level. For example, at the industry level, research that has been done at MSI Integrity, the organization I spoke about earlier, I've observed that worker voice does not necessarily equal worker power unless certain conditions relating to resourcing, governance rules, decision-making power are satisfied, which may also be material at the firm level. Similarly, on less appropriately structured models of co-governance and co-determination are established, it can risk the appearance of inclusivity and legitimacy while failing to meaningfully address the underlying power imbalances between workers and management, but also by creating systems of representation and governance that will privilege a certain race, gender, nationality, sexual identity, or class. And this is not to say that reforms should not be pursued, but rather that there is an urgent need to gather evidence, which have already been emerging in the conversations we've been having over the last couple of days, about how to ensure these efforts are meaningful and how do they actually result in a sharing of power and profits rather than just being rhetorically warming. Thank you.
Thank you, Fola. That was a very fulsome and helpful answer. Again, those who are looking at public companies and the contribution that they can make will certainly have learned quite a lot from that. We have 5 minutes left, so what I propose to do is to go over a couple of the questions that we've received, and this is perhaps the space in which the pithy and succinct nature of answers would be most appreciated. So our first question was asked about 50 minutes ago by Maya Street, who wanted to know if speakers could share insights and lessons learned on the relevance of conflict and social cohesion in relation to discussion of inequalities and the guiding principles. Maya goes on to say that the Working Group on Business and Human Rights identifies triggers and indicators that should lead to heightened action by states, businesses, and the UN system. So the question is, how can we improve approaches to conflict-sensitive business within the tool of the GPs? And I propose that we get maybe 1 or 2 responses at max so we can utilize the time best. Who has a burning desire to answer that question? Conflict and social cohesion in relation to business and the GPs. Sorka, could you perhaps take that one?
Thank you, Michael, for that one. It's a tricky one. I mean, my area of expertise is private military and security companies, and then you've also got other private actors that are operating in conflict spaces, that are full-blown mercenaries, and it makes it very, very difficult at the extreme end. You can't ask mercenary actors to carry out human rights due diligence. They're already engaging in armed conflict. They're already engaging in human rights violations. And with my UN working group hat on, we've seen this in Central African Republic. We've seen it in Libya. We've seen it in Nagorno-Karabakh, and you see other corporate actors being involved in that, and so with Libya and with Nagorno-Karabakh, we saw that private military and security companies based in Turkey were recruiting people, young men in particular, in some cases very young men, possibly even below the age of majority, and children. They're recruiting them from Syria. And they're taking advantage of the socioeconomic circumstances in Syria to hire young men, many of whom don't know that they're actually being hired as mercenaries. They think they're going to guard oil facilities in Libya or somewhere else, and then they find themselves on the front line. And I think there's, from my perspective, there are bigger issues than business and human rights when it comes to these sorts of actors in armed conflict zones, and the UNGPs in that specific situation are not going to be helpful.
Thank you very much. And Mustafa also wanted to raise a point.
Actually, no, I think that Sorka addressed that really well, so I'm happy to skip that one.
Excellent. And I believe that most of the written questions we've received have been answered by panelists in the course of their presentations or by text. But I think there was one question that we wanted to address to Tabi Sile, which I think very much resonates with the wider theme of the conference. So I'll just briefly read this out. There's something to be said about new generations of change makers and entrepreneurs that work within companies to get the changes we want to see that are being discussed over 2 days. Change comes from within is true too for a corporate setting, and it would be good to see examples, cases or stories. I believe we'll see those over the course of the next session that see people address these barriers. I think perhaps this is the point for Tabi Sile. How can we get or share insight into some of these efforts, successes, failures, struggles within the business, how the argument was compellingly raised, etc. So I think this is around how do we share knowledge throughout the ecosystem? Where can one go to find out about those stories, and who's celebrating best practice?
Thank you for that. I think that the challenge of celebrating stories is that the human rights environment is almost that environment that comes with a lot of stick associated with it. So we don't really take a carrot approach to the human rights environment. So I'm hoping that this conversation and the rest of the conference, as it continues, we begin to go back to, they call it self-regulation, peer review, and begin to share best practice so that as and when new people are implementing new methodologies, they're finding contexts that are difficult, there is almost an incentive to share the learnings, to share the failures without feeling that there will be that big stick of being seen as the company that violates human rights. So I'm almost hoping that we can debunk the conversation, because in this conference, we've almost had people saying, you know, not everybody knows what this human rights is beyond the narrowly defined area. So if we open it up, we begin to have a lot more dialogue, but we also become collaborative in the way we engage on human rights. As business, it cannot be for business to solve alone. We need to integrate ourselves into governments. We need to integrate ourselves into communities in whose rights are being violated, so that the kind of solutions that we come up with, even the frameworks that we are talking about today, can be inclusive. Because as I said earlier, it's about dignity, and equality and dignity is about inclusion, so that the solutions that you come up with, and there's a slogan from one organization in my country that says, not for us, without us. So could we then resist the temptation of inclusive, where the abuser and the abused, and I'm not talking about gross human rights violations, I'm talking about the serious ones that we may be blind, have blind spots to, we can begin to have a dialogue and create a new reality, a shared value, a common lexicon. Because what Sosha said earlier for me is the biggest issue. We talk about these things, the definitions are left for the few. The rest of the people, because it's in different languaging, it gets lost into translation. We then lose the depth of solving some of the fundamental barriers of human rights violations, but barriers to inequality that could have easily been resolved if we had paid attention to simple things like the right to access to language, to access to digitization, to access to technology. So if we can be a lot more inclusive in the dialogue, but maybe, as some people always say, in some instances, honey works better than vinegar, we might be in a better position to make the circle that has the conversation on human rights bigger, so that we can get to a new reality as we move to the next century.
Thank you very much. And again, a very fulsome answer to the question. So I'd like to wrap up this session by rehabilitating the comments I made at the start of this session around the individual, the cultural, and the systemic manifestations of inequality and discrimination that can oppress disadvantaged groups. At the time when Stephen Lawrence suffered the ignominy of a racist killing, and then the state, in its institutionally racist manner, not caring about the death of a young black boy with sufficient investigation, a law came out of it at the end that said it was unlawful to racially discriminate, and that there was an obligation upon public authorities to think about the impact on racialized minorities when they're producing policy. And I think that's very much similar to the sort of process that a company aiming to subscribe to the UNGPs in its due diligence process should be seeking to give effect to. There are currently discussions about the duty that I was discussing, about whether or not it goes far enough, whether or not it should look less at the process by which a decision is reached, and whether or not it should think more about the outcome. And I think in the next session, speakers will be thinking past the status quo to the way forward, and thinking about whether or not there should also be a duty to prevent in this system of trying to get business to subscribe to human rights principles. Thank you so much to all of our attendees for your very engaging questions throughout the seminar, and for the incredibly learned and astute contributions of the panelists. Thank you so much for not only giving your time today, but also for the tremendous work that you do that makes an incredible difference to the lives of some very troubled people and difficult lives across the world. Thank you again for our organisers and hosts, and look forward to the next session. It'll be great. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. And remember, hashtag SYSTINEQ21 for those of you who are on the Twitter sphere and elsewhere.